The widow Rose Harlow had been selling flowers outside the Silver Spur Saloon in Evanston, Wyoming, for 2 years when the cowboy bought every last bloom and changed her life forever. Rose stood in the morning sun on that June day in 1882, her worn calico dress already dusty from the walk into town. At 24 years old, she had been a widow for 3 years, her husband Thomas killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but grief and debts. The flowers she grew in her small garden and sold each morning kept her from starving, though barely. Her hands were calloused from digging in the earth, her face sun-browned despite the bonnet she wore, and her dark hair was pulled back severely from features that might have been pretty if not for the constant worry etched into them. She arranged the wildflowers and cultivated roses in their buckets, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the rough wooden buildings lining the street. Evanston was a railroad town, full of rough men and rougher entertainment, and the Silver Spur was its beating heart. Most mornings, Rose sold a stem or two to men stumbling out after a long night, or to respectable women heading to the general store who wanted to brighten their homes. It was enough to keep her small cabin and buy cornmeal and beans. The cowboy came riding in on a bay gelding just as the sun cleared the mountains to the east. Rose noticed him immediately because he sat his horse differently than most men who came through Evanston. There was an ease about him, a confidence that did not require swagger. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were dusty from travel, his hat worn but well made, and he carried himself like a man who knew his own mind. He dismounted outside the saloon and tied his horse to the rail, pausing to let the animal drink from the trough. Then he turned toward Rose, and she found herself looking into eyes the color of summer sky. "Morning, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good morning, sir," Rose replied, straightening from her buckets. "Would you like to buy some flowers?" He walked closer, and she could see the trail dust on his boots, the wear on his holster. A working cowboy then, not a gunfighter or gambler. Those were the dangerous ones, and she had learned to spot them. "These are real pretty," he said, studying her display with what seemed like genuine interest. "You grow them yourself?" "Yes, sir. I have a small garden outside of town. These roses are particularly hardy, and the wildflowers I gather from the meadows to the south." He nodded slowly, then looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I will take them." "Which ones, sir?" "All of them." Rose blinked, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry, I do not understand." "All the flowers, every one, how much would that be?" She stared at him, her mind struggling to calculate. On a good day she might sell half her stock for $3 or $4. To sell everything at once was unheard of. That would be $15, sir." "But surely you do not want all of them." $15. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, counting out bills and coins with steady hands. "That seems more than fair. Here's 20. I am guessing you could use the extra." Rose's pride warred with her practicality. The extra $5 would buy flour and sugar, maybe even a bit of bacon. But charity from a stranger, especially a man, felt dangerous in ways she could not quite articulate. "I could not accept more than the fair price," she said quietly. The cowboy's expression softened. "Then call it a payment for delivery. I am staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, 3 streets over. Could you bring them there this afternoon?" It was a reasonable request, and Mrs. Patterson was a respectable widow herself who ran a clean establishment. Rose nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, I could do that. Around 3 o'clock. Perfect." He handed her the money, and their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. His hands were calloused like hers, marked by hard work. "My name is Robert Reed. Most folks call me Reed." "Rose Harlow," she said, tucking the money carefully into her pocket. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Reed." "Just Reed is fine." He smiled then, a slow, warm expression that made something flutter in her chest that she thought had died with Thomas. "I will see you this afternoon, Mrs. Harlow." He tipped his hat again and walked into the saloon, leaving Rose standing amid her buckets of flowers, confused and oddly hopeful in a way she had not felt in years. The rest of the morning passed in a daze. Rose walked home to her cabin, carrying the empty buckets and the money that felt impossibly heavy in her pocket. Her small home sat on the edge of town, a one-room structure with a lean-to for her cow and a small garden that she tended with fierce devotion. It was not much, but it was hers, paid for with Thomas's life insurance before the mining company's debts had consumed everything else. She spent the afternoon in careful preparation, arranging the flowers in 3 large bundles wrapped in damp cloth to keep them fresh. She changed from her work dress into her better one, a faded blue cotton that had been her Sunday best before Thomas died. She could not have said why it mattered what she wore to make a delivery, but somehow it did. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a tall white structure, well-maintained and respectable. Rose had done washing for Mrs. Patterson occasionally when money was especially tight. The older woman answered the door herself, her sharp eyes taking in Rose and her armload of flowers. "Rose Harlow, what brings you here?" "I have a delivery for one of your guests, madam, a Mr. Robert Reed." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted into something almost mischievous. "Did he now? That is interesting. He is in the parlor. Come in, dear." The boarding house interior was cool and dim after the bright afternoon sun. Rose followed Mrs. Patterson into a neat parlor where Reed sat reading a newspaper. He stood immediately when they entered, setting the paper aside. "Mrs. Harlow, right on time." He took the bundles from her arms with care. "These are even prettier than they were this morning." "I kept them in water as long as I could," Rose said, suddenly nervous in the enclosed space. He seemed larger indoors, his presence filling the room. "They should last several days if you change the water daily." "I appreciate the advice." He set the flowers on a side table and turned back to her. "Would you join me for coffee? Mrs. Patterson makes excellent coffee." It was forward, but Mrs. Patterson was already nodding. "I will bring a pot," the older woman said, disappearing before Rose could protest. Rose stood uncertainly by the door. "I should not impose." "You would not be imposing, I asked." Reed gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I would like to talk with you if you are willing." There was something in his tone, a sincerity that made her slowly cross the room and settle on the edge of an upholstered chair. Reed took a seat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I should explain about the flowers," he said. "I imagine you think I am either foolish or strange." "I think you are generous," Rose said carefully, "but I confess, I do not understand why anyone would need so many flowers. The truth is, I do not need them at all. I bought them because I wanted to help you, and I figured you would not accept help without giving something in exchange." Heat rose in Rose's cheeks. "I do not need charity, Mr. Reed. Reed, and I know you do not. I watched you for 10 minutes before I approached, and I could see you are a woman who has earned every dollar she has. But there's no shame in accepting a helping hand, is there, Mrs. Patterson returned with a coffee service before Rose could respond, setting it down with a knowing smile before leaving again. Reed poured for both of them, his movements practiced. "I came to Evanston looking for work," he said, handing her a cup. "I have been working cattle drives for 10 years, since I was 18, and I have saved enough to start my own small ranch. There's land for sale north of here, good grazing land with water rights. I saw it last month and made an offer. I am here to finalize the purchase." Rose sipped her coffee, trying to understand where this was leading. "Congratulations. That sounds like a good opportunity." "It is. But a ranch is a lot of work for one man, especially starting out. I will need to hire help eventually, but first I need to get the place running. The house needs work, the fences need mending, there's stock to buy." He paused, looking at her directly. "I could use a partner." The coffee cup rattled slightly in Rose's hand. "I am not sure what you mean." "I mean, I am asking if you would consider marrying me." The world seemed to tilt. Rose set down her cup carefully before she dropped it. "You cannot be serious. We met this morning." "I am completely serious. And yes, we just met, but I know some things already. I know you are a hard worker. I know you are honest and proud. I know you have been dealt some hard luck, but you have not let it break you. I know I find you beautiful, and I know that when you looked at me this morning, I felt something I have not felt in all my years of wandering." Rose's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You know nothing about me. I could be a terrible person. Are you?" "No, but that is not the point." "Then what is the point?" He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Rose, I am not a romantic man by nature. I am practical. I have been saving for 10 years to have my own place, my own future. But I have also been alone for a long time, and I am tired of it. When I saw you this morning, standing in the sun with those flowers, looking so damn brave and beautiful, I thought, there is a woman worth taking a chance on." "This is insane," Rose whispered, but her mind was racing. A ranch, land, security. And more than that, the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her, the warmth that spread through her chest at his words. "Maybe it is," Reed agreed. "But is it any more insane than selling flowers outside a saloon in a railroad town, hoping to make enough to survive another week? Is it more insane than facing each day alone when you could face it with someone beside you?" Rose stood abruptly, crossing to the window that looked out onto the street. She could see the silver spur from here, could imagine herself standing there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, slowly wearing down until she was too old or too sick to dig in her garden anymore. The alternative was to trust this stranger, this man who claimed to feel something after one glance, to want her for reasons she could not quite fathom. "Why?" she asked quietly, not turning around. "Why me? You must have met countless women in your travels." "I have. And none of them made me want to stop traveling." His voice was closer now, though he did not touch her. "I cannot explain it better than that. Sometimes you just know." "I do not know you," Rose said, but it felt like a weak argument even to her own ears. "Then get to know me." "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. Court me, Rose. Let me court you properly. Let me prove I am serious about this. If after a month you do not feel anything, I will buy your flowers every day until I leave town, and we will part as friends." She turned to face him. He was standing close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the small scar on his chin. He was handsome, yes, but more than that, he looked kind. And God help her, she was so tired of being alone. 1 month, she heard herself say. "But I will not be courted in secret like I have something to hide. If we do this, we do it properly, where everyone can see." Reed's face broke into a smile that transformed his features from handsome to breathtaking. "Whatever you want. Can I start by taking you to dinner tonight?" "Yes," Rose said, and felt the word open something inside her that had been closed for far too long. "Yes, you can." The next 4 weeks unfolded like a dream Rose was afraid of waking from. Reed proved to be a man of his word. He showed up at her cabin the next morning to help her in the garden, pulling weeds and hauling water without being asked. He escorted her into town each day and sat with her while she sold her flowers, chatting with customers and making her laugh with stories from his years on the trail. He told her about growing up in Kansas, the son of farmers who had died of cholera when he was 16. He told her about his first cattle drive, his first horse, the winters spent in lined shacks watching over herds in the snow. He told her about the loneliness of the cowboy life, the way you could be surrounded by men and still feel completely alone. Rose found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. About how Thomas had been a good man but a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike that would make them rich. About the relief mixed with guilt she had felt when he died, because at least the uncertainty was over. About the shame of being poor in a town that judged a woman's worth by her husband's success. "You are worth more than any man's success," Reed told her one evening as they sat on her cabin steps watching the sun set over the mountains. "You built this life yourself. That is worth more than gold." He kissed her that night, gentle and questioning, and Rose kissed him back with a fervor that surprised them both. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time since Thomas died she felt safe. But not everything was perfect. The town noticed the courtship, and not everyone approved. Some whispered that Rose was forgetting her late husband too quickly, that it was not proper for a widow to be seen laughing so soon. Others suggested that Reed must have ulterior motives, that no cowboy would seriously court a poor widow unless he was after something. The worst came from Thomas's brother, Martin, who showed up at Rose's cabin one afternoon in the third week, his face red with anger and whiskey. "You are disgracing my brother's memory," he spat, swaying slightly in her doorway. "Whoring yourself to some drifter before Thomas is cold in the ground." Reed, who had been repairing Rose's fence, was there in an instant. "You need to leave, now. Or what, cowboy, you will shoot me." Martin laughed bitterly. "You think I do not know your type. You will use her up and move on, and where will she be then?" I said leave. Reed's voice was quiet but hard as iron. "Mrs. Harlow does not need to hear your poison." Rose stepped forward, her own anger rising. "Martin, your brother has been dead for 3 years. I mourned him, I paid his debts, and I have survived on my own. I owe you nothing, least of all an explanation for how I choose to live my life." "Thomas deserved better than you," Martin snarled. "Maybe. But he married me anyway, and he would want me to be happy. If you cannot wish me well, then stay away." Martin left, but his words left a stain on the day. Reed held Rose while she cried, angry tears for the unfairness of it all, for the way women were judged for every choice they made. "Do you want to stop?" Reed asked quietly. "If this is making your life harder, we can slow down." "No," Rose said fiercely. "No, I do not want to stop. I want to be happy, Reed. I want what you are offering. I am just scared." "Of what?" "Of losing it. Of losing you. I love Thomas, but what I feel for you is different, stronger. It terrifies me." Reed tilted her face up to his. "I am terrified too. I have been alone so long I almost forgot how to be any other way. But Rose, I swear to you I am not going anywhere. I am not Thomas, chasing dreams. I know exactly what I want, and I am looking at her." They were married 4 weeks to the day after they met, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Evanston with Mrs. Patterson and the minister's wife as witnesses. Rose wore a new dress that Reed had insisted on buying her, pale yellow cotton with lace at the collar. Reed wore a new suit, dark and well-fitted, and when he looked at her standing beside him, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I, Robert Reed, take you, Rose Harlow, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, to work hard for our future, to honor you and cherish you all the days of my life." Rose's voice shook as she repeated her own vows, but her hand was steady in his. When the minister pronounced them married and Reed kissed her, soft and sweet, she felt the last of her fear dissolve. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house, in a room Mrs. Patterson had decorated with wildflowers. Reed was gentle with Rose, patient and tender, and if there was awkwardness in their coming together, there was also joy and laughter and the deep satisfaction of two lonely people finding connection. "Mrs. Rose Reed murmured against her hair as they lay tangled together in the darkness. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Rose whispered back, and meant it with her whole heart. They moved to the ranch a week later after Rose had sold her cabin and garden to a young family just arrived in Evanston. The money would help with starting the ranch, buying cattle and supplies. Reed had already been working on the property during their courtship, and he had hired 2 ranch hands, good men who treated Rose with respect. The ranch house was bigger than Rose's cabin but in need of work. The roof leaked, the floors were warped, and the whole place smelled of mice and neglect. But it had good bones, Reed said, and Rose could see the truth of it. There were 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house with a view of the mountains that took her breath away. "We will make it beautiful," Reed promised, his arm around her waist as they stood looking at their new home. "It will take time, but we will do it together." They worked from dawn to dusk those first months. Rose scrubbed and whitewashed and sewed curtains while Reed and the ranch hands mended fences and built a new barn and brought in the first small herd of cattle. It was back-breaking work, but Rose had never been happier. Every nail Reed hammered, every wall she painted, was building something that was theirs. Not Thomas's dream, not something she was struggling to maintain alone, but a life they were creating together. At night, they would sit on the porch after dinner, too tired to do anything but lean against each other and watch the stars come out. Reed would tell her about the plans for next year, the calves they would sell, the improvements they could make. Rose would tell him about the garden she was planning, huge and productive, and maybe some chickens for eggs and meat. "We should get a dog," Reed said one evening. "A good cattle dog to help with the herds, and for company when I am out on the range." "I would like that," Rose said. "What kind?" "There's a rancher over in Bear River who breeds Australian shepherds. Smart dogs, good workers. I thought we might ride over next month and take a look." They made the trip on a crisp October morning, riding double on Reed's bay, gelding with Rose's arms wrapped around his waist. The rancher, an older man named Sam, had 3 pups left from a recent litter, fluffy balls of fur with bright eyes and wagging tails. Rose fell in love immediately with the smallest one, a female with a black and white coat and one blue eye. The pup licked her face enthusiastically and then promptly fell asleep in her lap. "That one has been the runt," Sam said. "But she has got spirit. I think she will make a good dog with the right training." They brought the puppy home, and Rose named her Star for the white patch on her forehead. The little dog became Rose's constant companion, following her around the house and garden. And as she grew, she proved Sam right about her spirit. She learned quickly, eager to please, and by spring she was helping Reed move the cattle with the confidence of a much older dog. Winter that first year was hard. The snow came early and deep, and there were days when Rose could not see the barn from the house for the blowing white. Reed and the hands worked around the clock to keep the cattle fed and the water troughs from freezing. Rose kept the fires burning and the food coming, baking bread and cooking stews that would stick to a man's ribs through long, cold days. But even in the hardship, there was joy. Christmas morning, Rose woke to find Reed had carved her a set of wooden flowers, perfect replicas of the roses she had sold outside the saloon. "So you will always remember where we started," he said. Rose gave him a shirt she had sewn, soft flannel in dark blue. "So you will stay warm," she said, and did not add when you are away from me, though they both knew that was what she meant. By spring, Rose knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for weeks but waited to be sure before telling Reed. She chose a moment when they were alone in the barn, Reed brushing down the horses after a long day. "I have something to tell you," she said, and he must have heard something in her voice because he set down the brush immediately and turned to her. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine." "Better than fine." "Reed, I am going to have a baby." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "A baby." "Rose, we are going to have a baby." He set her down carefully, suddenly worried. "Are you sure you are all right? Should you be out here? You need to rest." She laughed at his concern. "I am perfectly healthy. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Reed. I am not going to break." But he fussed over her anyway, insisting she take on lighter chores, bringing her wildflowers and treating her like she was made of glass. Rose found it alternately endearing and exasperating, but she could not deny the warmth that filled her every time she saw him looking at her belly with wonder. The baby came in early January of 1884, during a snowstorm that trapped them in the house for 3 days. The midwife from town could not get through, so it was just Reed and Rose, working together to bring their child into the world. Rose had been terrified, but Reed had been steady and calm, holding her hand and encouraging her through the long hours of labor. When their son finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Reed had tears streaming down his face. "He is beautiful," Reed whispered, staring at the tiny bundle in Rose's arms. "Rose, he is perfect." "Robert," Rose said softly. "We should name him Robert after his father." Reed shook his head. "No, I want him to have his own name. How about Ryan?" "Ryan Reed." Rose tested the name. "I like it. Hello, Ryan. Welcome to the world, little one." The baby's arrival changed everything and nothing. The ranch work continued, but now it centered around the tiny life they had created. Rose marveled at how something so small could require so much attention, but she found she did not mind the sleepless nights and constant feedings. Ryan was a good baby, healthy and growing fast, and watching Reed with his son made Rose fall in love with her husband all over again. Reed was a natural father, patient and gentle, singing off-key lullabies and walking the floor with Ryan when he fussed. He built a cradle with his own hands, smooth and sturdy, and carved animals to hang above it that turned slowly in the breeze. The ranch prospered over the next few years. The herd grew, the house improvements continued, and Rose's garden became legendary in the area. She grew more flowers than ever, huge beds of roses and wildflowers that she no longer needed to sell. Instead, she gave them freely to anyone who visited, wanting to share the beauty that had brought her and Reed together. When Ryan was 3, they had another child, a daughter they named Ruby. She was born in the spring, with the midwife in attendance this time, and she came into the world with a full head of dark hair and her father's blue eyes. Ryan was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. "Gentle," Rose would remind him, guiding his small hand to stroke Ruby's soft head. "She is very little." The ranch house was full of noise and life now, so different from the lonely silence Rose had known as a widow. There were arguments and tears, of course, as in any family. But there was also laughter and love and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting. One evening when Ryan was 5 and Ruby 2, Rose and Reed sat on their porch watching their children play with Star in the yard. The dog, fully grown now, was patient with the children's rough affection, herding them gently when they wandered too far. "You ever regret it?" Reed asked suddenly. "Marrying me so quickly? taking such a chance on a stranger. Rose looked at her husband, at the fine lines starting to show around his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair. She thought about the scared, lonely widow she had been, selling flowers and barely surviving. She thought about the leap of faith she had taken, the trust she had placed in this man who had seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single moment. You gave me back my life, Reed. You gave me a future I never dreamed I could have." "You did the same for me," he said, taking her hand. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You made me want to build something, to put down roots. You made me want to be better." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Rose thought about the flowers she used to sell outside the saloon, how she had stood there day after day hoping for enough money to survive. She thought about the day Reed had bought them all, had seen her not as a poor widow but as a woman worth taking a chance on. "I love you," she said, simple and true. "I love you too," Reed replied, lifting her hand to kiss her knuckles. "Today and always." The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and growth. The ranch expanded, more land purchased, more cattle added to the herd. Reed hired more hands to help with the increased work, and Rose found herself managing a household that sometimes included half a dozen men needing feeding. She did not mind. She liked the bustle, the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. Ryan grew tall and serious, his father's son in temperament and looks. He followed Reed everywhere when he was not in school, learning the ranch work and the careful stewardship of the land. Ruby was more like Rose, practical and warm-hearted, with a green thumb that showed itself early. By the time she was 6, she had her own section of the garden and sold flowers at the church bazaar, though she gave most of them away to anyone who looked like they needed cheering up. When Rose was 32, she had another child, a surprise late baby that made Reed walk around grinning like a fool for weeks. Another son, born during a thunderstorm in July, who they named Rory. He was different from his older siblings, impish and charming even as an infant, with Rose's dark hair and a smile that could get him out of any trouble. The 3 children filled the house with noise and joy, tracking mud across Rose's clean floors and bringing in stray animals they wanted to keep. Ryan brought home an orphaned fawn once that had to be bottle-fed until it was strong enough to return to the wild. Ruby collected baby birds with broken wings and nursed them back to health. Rory befriended every ranch hand and visiting Cowboy, chattering away without shyness. Rose and Reed watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and wonder. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Reed presented Rose with a painting he had commissioned from an artist passing through Evanston. It showed Rose as she had been that first day, standing outside the saloon with her buckets of flowers, the morning sun turning her hair to gold. "So you will always remember your strength," he said. "Before I came along and made things easier." Rose traced the image with one finger, remembering that woman that time. "You did not make things easier," she said. "You made them better. There is a difference." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together in their bedroom, the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. Rose was brushing her hair, and Reed was watching her with that expression she had learned, meant he was feeling philosophical. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am. How different my life could have been if I had ridden into Evanston a day earlier or later, if I had not decided to buy those flowers." "I would have sold them to someone else," Rose said practically. "I would have survived. I know you would have, but I might not have. Not really. I was heading toward a lonely old age, Rose. A successful one maybe, but lonely. You saved me as much as I saved you. Rose set down her brush and crossed to him, settling into his lap with the ease of long familiarity. Then we saved each other. That seems fair. He kissed her, soft and deep, and Rose thought about all the kisses they had shared over the years. The first tentative ones during their courtship, the passionate ones as newlyweds, the tired ones at the end of long days, the joyful ones when the children were born. Each one a promise kept, a choice made, a life built word by word and touch by touch. The ranch continued to thrive. By the time Ryan was 16, he was working alongside his father as a full partner, his opinions valued and his work ethic respected by all the hands. He had grown into a fine young man, steady and reliable, with plans to eventually take over the ranch when Reed retired. Ruby, at 14, was already being courted, much to her father's dismay. A young man from a neighboring ranch had started finding excuses to visit, bringing gifts of wildflowers that made Rose hide her smile behind her hand. Reed grumbled about boys and shotguns, but Rose could see he approved of the young man's respectful manner and hard-working nature. Rory, at 10, was still all energy and mischief, but he had a kind heart that made everyone love him. He was the one who noticed when someone was sad and tried to cheer them up, who shared his candy with other children and helped the ranch hands with their chores without being asked. Rose and Reed were in their 40s now, no longer young but far from old. They had the weathered look of people who spent their lives outdoors, the strength of those who worked with their hands. Reed's hair was more silver than brown, and Rose had lines around her eyes, but they were happy lines, earned through years of laughter. One spring day, Rose was working in her garden when a family came up the road in a wagon, clearly new to the area and looking lost. She set down her tools and walked to meet them, shading her eyes against the sun. "Can I help you folks?" she asked. The man driving was young, maybe mid-20s, with a tired-looking wife beside him and two small children in the back. "We are looking for the Raid Ranch," he said. "We were told Mr. Reed might be hiring. You found it. I am Mrs. Reed. My husband is up at the north pasture, but he should be back soon. Would you like to come up to the house and wait? I just made lemonade." The man's wife looked ready to cry with gratitude. "That would be so kind, madam." "We have been traveling for 3 days." Rose led them to the house, settling them on the porch with drinks and cookies, while the children stared wide-eyed at everything. She recognized the look in the young wife's eyes, the desperate hope mixed with fear. She had worn that look herself once, standing outside a saloon selling flowers and hoping for enough money to survive. When Reed rode in an hour later, Rose pulled him aside. "They need the work," she said quietly, "and we could use another hand with spring calving coming up." Reed studied the family, and Rose knew he was seeing what she had seen. "I will talk to him," he agreed. The young man, whose name was Tom, proved to be a good worker, and his wife Sarah helped Rose with the household chores and garden. Their children played with Rory and quickly became part of the ranch family. Watching Sarah bloom from a frightened, exhausted woman into someone with hope in her eyes reminded Rose of her own journey. "You are giving them what you gave me," she told Reed one night. "A chance." "I learned from the best," he replied, pulling her close. The years continued their steady march. Ryan married at 22, bringing his bride Clara to live on the ranch. She was a rancher's daughter herself, practical and hardworking, and she fit into the family as if she had always been there. Within a year, she gave birth to Reed and Rose's first grandchild, a boy they named Thomas. Holding her grandson for the first time, Rose thought about her first husband, the man whose memory had grown softer and kinder over the years. She hoped he would have been happy for her, would have approved of the life she had built. "You think about him?" Reed asked quietly that night. He rarely mentioned Thomas, respecting that Rose's first marriage was a part of her history he did not need to understand completely. "Sometimes," Rose admitted, "but not with sadness anymore. He was part of my journey, Reed. He brought me to Evanston, which brought me to you. I can be grateful for that without wishing things were different." Ruby married at 19, the young rancher who had been courting her for years finally winning Reed's blessing. They built a house on his family's land, just a few miles away, close enough for frequent visits. She continued her mother's tradition, keeping a huge garden and giving away flowers to anyone who needed them. Rory, true to his changeable nature, decided at 18 that ranch life was not for him. He wanted to see the world, to try different things. It broke Rose's heart a little when he left, but she understood. Not everyone was meant to put down roots in the place they were born. "He will come back," Reed assured her, holding her as she cried on the day Rory rode out. "Maybe not to stay, but he will come back. This is his home." Reed was right. Rory came back often, full of stories about his adventures working on different ranches, trying his hand at various trades. He never stayed long, but each visit was a gift, and Rose learned to treasure them rather than wishing for more. When Rose was 51, Reed had a health scare. He had been out checking the fences when his horse spooked and threw him. He broke his leg and several ribs, and the doctor ordered him to rest for weeks. Reed was a terrible patient, frustrated and grumbling, but the accident reminded them both that they were not invincible. "We should think about the future," Rose said one evening as Reed sat with his leg propped up, watching her darn socks. "About what happens when we are too old to run the ranch ourselves. Ryan can handle it," Reed said. "He has been ready for years." "I know, but I mean us. What do we want to do when we are not working dawn to dusk anymore?" Reed was quiet for a long moment. "I want to travel with you." "Not far, just around Wyoming and maybe Montana. I want to show you places I saw when I was young, when I never thought I would have anyone to share them with." "I would like that," Rose said. "And I want to write down our story, for the grandchildren, so they know how we started. You standing outside a saloon selling flowers and me being foolish enough to buy them all. You being brave enough to take a chance on love," Rose corrected. "That is not foolish. That is the best kind of brave. They did both those things." As Reed healed and Ryan took on more of the ranch management, Rose and Reed began taking trips, just a week or two at a time, exploring the landscape that had shaped them. They visited the site where Reed had worked his first cattle drive, now surrounded by farms. They rode into the mountains where he had spent winters in lined shacks, and Rose tried to imagine her husband young and alone in those wild places. Rose wrote their story in the evenings, filling journal after journal with memories and details. She wrote about selling flowers and living alone and being so tired of barely surviving. She wrote about the day Reed bought all her flowers, about his proposal and their courtship, and the life they had built together. "You make it sound like a fairy tale," Reed said, reading over her shoulder one evening. "It is a fairy tale," Rose replied, "just one that happens to be true." The grandchildren multiplied over the years. Ryan and Clara had 4 children in total. Ruby had 3. Even Rory, on one of his visits home, brought a young woman he had married in his travels, a school teacher named Rebecca who charmed them all. They settled in Evanston, where she taught and he worked various jobs, finally finding contentment in putting down roots. The ranch house that had seemed so large when Rose and Reed first moved in now felt crowded during family gatherings, filled with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. All the noise and chaos that came with a family that had grown from 2 lonely people taking a chance on each other. Rose turned 60 in 1896, and Reed threw her a party that included half the county. There was food and music and dancing, And at one point, Rose found herself standing on the porch looking out at the crowd, overwhelmed by how much her life had changed. Reed found her there, as he always did when she needed him. Hiding from your own party, just taking it all in. Reed, do you realize how many people are here because we met? Our children and grandchildren, yes, but also the families of all the people we have hired over the years. Tom and Sarah's children, who are grown now with children of their own. The community we have been part of. All of it spreading out from that one morning when you bought my flowers. You give me too much credit, Reed said. You would have built a good life without me. Different, Rose agreed. But I like this one. I like the life we built together. So do I. He pulled her close, and they stood together watching their family and friends, the lanterns beginning to glow as the sun set. I love you, Rose Reed. Best decision I ever made buying those flowers. Best decision I ever made, selling them to you, Rose replied. They stood together as the stars came out, the same stars that had watched over them through all their years together. Inside the house, someone started playing a waltz, and Reed led Rose back into the light and music, into the life they had created from hope and hard work and love. The new century arrived, bringing changes to Wyoming and to their family. The railroad expanded, Evanston grew, and ranching changed with new techniques and technologies. But the Reed Ranch continued, passed now primarily into Ryan's capable hands while Rose and Reed enjoyed a slower pace. They spent their mornings working in the garden, Rose with her beloved flowers, and Reed with vegetables that he took absurd pride in growing larger than anyone else's. They spent afternoons with their grandchildren, telling stories and teaching skills. They spent evenings on their porch, watching the sun set over land they had worked and loved for decades. When Rose was 68 and Reed 71, they took one last trip together. They rode back to Evanston, to the place where the Silver Spur Saloon had stood. It was gone now, replaced by a more respectable establishment, but the spot where Rose had sold her flowers was still there. I can see you so clearly, Reed said, standing in that spot, young and beautiful and trying so hard to be brave. I was terrified, Rose admitted, every single day. I thought I would end up old and alone and poor, dying in some boarding house with no one to mourn me. Instead, you got old and surrounded by people who love you, Reed said. And you are still beautiful, by the way, Rose laughed. Liar. I am old and weathered. Beautiful, Reed insisted. The most beautiful thing I have ever seen was you standing here with those flowers. The most beautiful thing I see every day is you across the breakfast table. That will not change, Rose. Not ever. They stood together in the place where their story had started, and Rose felt the fullness of a life well lived. She thought about the frightened widow she had been and the woman she had become. She thought about Reed, who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the community and all the ways their lives had rippled outward to touch others. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For buying my flowers, for taking a chance, for loving me. Thank you for saying yes, Reed replied. For trusting me, for building this life with me. They returned to the ranch as the leaves were turning gold, settling back into their routine. Reed's health was not what it once was, and Rose moved slower than she had in her youth, but they were content. They had lived long enough to see their children established, their grandchildren growing, their great-grandchildren being born. They had built something lasting. Reed died in his sleep on a cold January morning when he was 73 and Rose was 70. She woke to find him gone, peaceful in the bed they had shared for decades. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her, but she survived it because that was what she did. She survived. The funeral was huge. people coming from all over Wyoming to pay respects to a man who had been respected and loved. Rose accepted their condolences with grace, but inside she felt hollowed out, empty in a way she had not felt since Thomas died all those years ago. But this was different, deeper. Thomas had been a brief chapter in her life, a starting point. Reed had been everything after. He had been her partner, her lover, her best friend. He had been the person who saw her truly and loved her anyway. Without him, she felt incomplete. Ryan tried to convince her to move into town or to live with him and Clara in the main ranch house. But Rose refused. She stayed in the house she and Reed had made theirs, surrounded by memories and the life they had built. She worked in the garden, spending hours among the flowers that had brought them together. She wrote in her journals, filling page after page with memories, afraid of forgetting even the smallest detail. The spring after Reed died, Rose planted a new garden bed, the largest and most elaborate she had ever attempted. She filled it entirely with roses, dozens of varieties in every color. When they bloomed that summer, their scent filled the air around the house, and Rose sat among them and cried and laughed and talked to Reed as if he were still beside her. "I miss you," she told the flowers, the air, the memory of the man she loved. "Every single day I miss you. But I am grateful too, so grateful for the time we had. You gave me everything, Reed, everything." She lived 3 more years, years filled with her children and grandchildren, with the garden and the ranch and the community she had been part of for so long. She finished writing their story, leaving it for future generations to know how their family had started. She made sure everyone understood that love was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. Rose died peacefully at 73, sitting in her garden on a June morning with the roses in full bloom around her. Ryan found her there, a peaceful expression on her face, her hand still holding the stems of the flowers she had been cutting. They buried her next to Reed on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains and the land they had loved. The gravestone was simple, with both their names and the dates of their lives, but Ryan added one more line at the bottom. She sold flowers. He bought them all. Together they built love. The ranch continued under Ryan's management and eventually passed to his children and their children after. The house stood for generations, expanded and modernized but keeping its essential character. The garden that Rose had planted and tended for so many years was maintained by her descendants, a living memorial to the woman who had turned a hard life into a beautiful one through determination and love. Ruby's descendants became known throughout Wyoming for their gardens and their generosity with flowers. Rory's children spread across the West, but they all returned to the ranch for important occasions, drawn by the story of their grandparents and the legacy they had created. The journals Rose had kept, the story she had written of her life with Reed, became family treasures, passed down and read to each new generation. Children grew up hearing about the widow who sold flowers and the cowboy who bought them all, who took a chance on love and built a life that lasted beyond their own lifetimes. In Evanston, a small park was eventually created on the site where the Silver Spur Saloon had stood. A plaque was installed telling the story of Rose Harlow Reed, who had sold flowers there in the hard times after her first husband's death. The park featured elaborate flower beds, always kept blooming through the warm months, a memorial to a woman who had found beauty even in desperate circumstances. The story of Rose and Reed became part of local legend, told and retold with embellishments and romance. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a simple story about 2 people who had been lonely and lost, and who had found each other through flowers and faith and the willingness to take a chance. Young couples who visited the park would stand where Rose had once stood selling her flowers, and they would talk about love and chance and whether they believed in fate. Some left flowers at the base of the plaque, wild roses mostly, in honor of the woman who had turned flowers into her salvation. The ranch itself became a Wyoming landmark, one of the longest continuously operating family ranches in the state. Visitors were welcome to hear the story, to see the house where Rose and Reed had raised their children, to walk through gardens that still bloomed with the roses Rose had loved. The family maintained it not as a museum but as a living place, a working ranch that honored its history while continuing to grow and change. Great-great-grandchildren worked the land their ancestors had claimed and cultivated. They dealt with modern challenges, droughts and changing markets and the complications of contemporary life. But they did it with the foundation that Rose and Reed had established, the knowledge that hard work and love and taking chances could build something lasting. On June mornings, when the roses were in bloom and the sun came up over the mountains just as it had for more than a century, it was not hard to imagine Rose standing in her garden, her hands in the earth, a smile on her face as she tended her flowers. It was not hard to imagine Reed walking toward her, calling her in for breakfast, the love between them as present and real as it had been in life. Their story had become part of the landscape itself, woven into the history of Wyoming and the mythology of the West. It was a story about survival and second chances, about seeing the worth in another person and in yourself. It was about building something beautiful from desperate circumstances, about love that lasted beyond a single lifetime. And it had all started with flowers sold outside a saloon, a cowboy willing to spend $20 on a gesture of faith, and a widow brave enough to say yes to an impossible offer. Everything else had grown from that single moment, spreading like rose vines, creating beauty and sustenance and family and legacy. The land remembered. The flowers remembered. And every generation that came after remembered the story of Rose and Reed, the widow and the cowboy, and the love that had built something lasting from a single morning's chance encounter. Their story reminded people that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help, take a chance, and believe that tomorrow might be better than today. In the end, that was the real legacy Rose and Reed left behind. Not just the ranch or the family or the beautiful gardens, but the knowledge that love was possible even in the hardest circumstances. That two people who barely knew each other could build a lifetime together through trust and work and commitment. That happy endings were not just for fairy tales, but for anyone brave enough to reach for them. The flowers still bloomed every summer, roses and wildflowers mixing together in glorious profusion. The mountains still stood watch over the valley. The ranch still operated, cattle grazing the same pastures Reed had first claimed. And somewhere in the evening breeze that rustled through the roses, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear two voices laughing together, still finding joy in each other after all these years. Their love story had not ended with death. It had only transformed, becoming something larger than two individual people. It had become an inspiration, a reminder, a promise that love was worth fighting for, and that taking a chance on another person could change not just two lives but generations of lives to come. And so the story continued, told and retold, remembered and cherished, a testament to the power of flowers and faith and love to transform the world.